Over the last week or so, we've seen a little bit of a shift in the markets in terms of the areas that are working versus the areas that are not. And well, we had quite the eventful weekend, so we will touch a little bit on some of the political side of things here this week. But before we jump into that, we also have producer price index. So we'll talk a little bit about inflation and kind of tie that into the consumer price index numbers we had last week. We also had retail sales that started to tell a bit of a story. And then we will keep this a little bit shorter here this week. We'll skip the question of the week and come back to it next Thursday. My name is Brandon Steele, financial advisor with Mainsail Financial Group here in Bellevue. And our goal every Thursday is to bring to you the market news, the data, the trends that we're watching, and hopefully weed out a bit of the noise along the way. And I really want to kick things off this week talking about some of the data points, and then we'll talk about some of the events over the weekend. But the first thing I want to touch on is producer price index, or PPI. So PPI numbers came out on Friday as a follow-up to the consumer price index numbers that came out earlier in the week. For those who tuned in last week, you may remember that for the most part, the general theme on the consumer price index was that inflation was running a little bit lower than expected, still certainly, showing a year-over-year number that's higher than what the Fed would be aiming for, but nonetheless, a little bit lower than expected here for the month. Producer price index this week was actually a little bit mixed. So we had core PPI number, which was basically flat, but the expectations were for that to be slightly up. So let's call this a win in the inflation camp. However, the headline PPI number was actually up 0.2%, which was more than expected. So again, a bit of a conflicting data around the producer price index numbers specifically. And obviously, kind of dovetails with what we covered last week on the consumer price index. But again, maybe the takeaway of all of this is just be cautious of looking at one number in a vacuum. Obviously, hopefully this is a good sign on the inflation side of things, but I think the Fed and I think the theme, if we go back to last year, is just take this with a grain of salt, a bit of a grain of salt, until we see this consistently showing, that inflation is slowing. I think that it's too early to call it a win. We also had retail sales numbers come out. And retail sales were actually flat versus expectations of being down. So it doesn't sound very exciting, but we saw a lot of hope around this for the markets. And I want to spend a minute here because I thought this was really interesting. Over the last week or so, we've seen a little bit of a shift in the markets in terms of the areas that are working versus the areas that are not. And this retail sales number was certainly I don't want to say a factor in this, but certainly was a data point to kind of show, where this could be coming from as well. And then, of course, the big news over the weekend was the assassination attempt on former President Trump. So obviously, this was big news. And honestly, you may have noticed it didn't really do a whole lot in terms of market reaction on Monday. But I was actually talking about this with another advisor, and it was a really good point that was brought up, because we went into this weekend, or coming out of this weekend, we could have had a scenario where, we were close to, runner potentially being killed. And then we also had a scenario where, we could have seen the runner for the Democratic Party pull out. And so it would have been very interesting, obviously, on Monday to see if that scenario were to occur, where things would stand. I imagine the market would not like that very much with all the uncertainty. Luckily, that is not where we landed. But I thought it was a very interesting point. Just wanted to kind of share that observation. But obviously, again, the market reaction really was not too significant as a result of this on Monday. And we will see, obviously, where things take us from here. Again, we'll skip the question of the week. I'm kind of between office and an event today. Plus, we have our client town hall this evening. So I'm going to skip it this week, but we'll be right back next week to cover a question of the week, as well as Q2 GDP numbers, and then wholesale and retail inventories that might give us a little bit better glance at the strength of the consumer at the moment. Be sure to tune in next Thursday at 3. In the meantime, enjoy the sunshine this weekend, and we'll see you next week.